Welcome to another edition of Against the Current, coming to you from the Skyline Club atop the Old Republic Building in downtown Chicago. Pleased to have as my guest on this edition, Dan Patlak, who is in his third term as a commissioner on the Cook County Board of Review. We're going to talk all things property taxes in the state with the highest property tax burden in the nation. Dan, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me on. Appreciate it.
And I just want to say at the outset, since nobody will toot my own horn, I've got to toot it myself, that to demonstrate my deep and abiding commitment to my fellow man, I am not smoking on this edition for respect for your tobacco allergy.
I appreciate that, Dan. Very kind
So
of you.
I just wanted to give you the opportunity to recognize me as the gracious gentleman that I am.
You are very gracious.
Yeah, thank you.
I appreciate it.
So people just got their second installments in Cook County, second installment for their property tax bill, and they're happy they don't live in Lake County, but that's about all they can say. Average 10% increase. Tell us, give us a little bit of a tutorial on the Cook County property tax system, how it's different than the other 101 counties in Illinois, and how it works in terms of the determination of your property tax bill, and then the role that you and your board play to potentially provide relief for those who seek it.
That's a lot of stuff. How much time you got?
Yeah,
Dan?
well, give us the Reader's Digest version. No charts, no kind of Rube Goldberg details of how this works, but kind of top line, give us as best of a linear explanation as you can.
Okay, so Cook County is different than every other county in Illinois. In every other county in Illinois, assessments are done by township assessors. Now in Cook County there are 38 townships. 8 of them are in Chicago, which are just geographical areas. They're not governmental or political. But there are 30 suburban townships that are political entities. And in Cook County, our township assessors don't assess. Our township assessors are more what I would call taxpayer advocates. They're there to help the taxpayers with their appeals, to explain to them what their tax bills mean, help them get their exemptions, things like that.
So we have assessors that don't assess, but they still have they're still elected positions that have salaries and benefits at the township level in all these Cook County townships. And they're a taxpayer advocate, but you're also a taxpayer advocate in terms of providing a relief for those who apply for it where appropriate.
True.
So with it, I'm suggesting that maybe there's some overlapping of duties.
Not exactly. What we do at the Board of Review is we adjudicate appeals from aggrieved taxpayers. Now, you might think that the only good we do taxpayers is when we grant a reduction. I don't look at it that way. What I think is important is that we adjudicate the appeals fairly, so that those who deserve to get a reduction receive one. Those who don't, because if we were to grant a reduction to someone that didn't deserve a reduction, that reduction that they received would be spread out over all other taxpayers, and they'd all pay a little bit more. So it's important.
Thank you, J.B. Pritzker, for example.
Yes, yes. So it's important that we do a good job at the Board of Review. But getting back to your original question, so here in Cook County, all assessments are done by the Cook County assessor. The
Honorable Joe Barrios, the chairman of the Cook County Democrat Party.
The exact very same one. Of course, he has a staff of 325 or so.
And some of
people.
those are actually not family members.
That's right.
Shocking.
Yes.
A few of them are not family members, I understand.
A few.
Yeah.
In any case, so all the assessing in Cook County is done by the Cook County assessor. Assessing outside of Cook County is done by township assessors. Once the assessor has completed his assessment on a property, property owners have the option to appeal if they think that the assessment is unfair. They have a variety of places they can appeal to, and it's sort of linear. You used the word earlier. It's in order. So the first place you can appeal is to the Cook County assessor. And the Cook County assessor will open each township for appeal for a set period of time, usually about 30 days. You have that time period to file your appeal. The assessor will adjudicate that appeal based on the evidence you submit and the evidence he has available to him, and he may grant a reduction or he may leave it where it's at.
So for all of the Cook County property owners, what percentage of people actually appeal their taxes, and what percentage are successful in seeing reductions?
I don't know what the percentages are at the county assessor level, but I will talk about the Board of Review,
Okay.
which is the next level.
Yeah.
So if you go to the assessor, get a reduction, don't get a reduction, or if you don't go to the assessor at all, you can then come to the Board of Review.
So you can go to the assessor or the Board of Review?
Well,
as your
you can go to both.
Or either.
Or either. But you're not required to go to the assessor before you come to our office.
Right.
And if you come to the Board of Review, we operate the same in terms of opening townships for 30-day periods, and in which time you'd file your appeal.
Why is there two adjudicated bodies? Why can you go to the assessor or the Board of Review?
Well, when you're appealing to the assessor, you're appealing to the body that actually assessed the property. Some people might feel that they weren't getting a fair shake. So the state of Illinois actually created the Cook County Board of Review to make sure that there is a body that can overrule the assessor.
But can't the assessor also overrule the decisions of the Board of Review?
No. Any decision the Board of Review makes is good for, by law, 1 year. Typically, the Cook County Assessor will honor our decisions until the next triennial reassessment period. So for instance, if you appeal in the first year of your triennial reassessment, in most cases, if we grant a reduction, that reduction will stay for that year and the following 2 years. Mm-hmm. However, the assessor does have the authority, if he so chooses, to overrule a decision after the first year. And he does that once in a while, but it's rare. It's when he has, a big difference of opinion on us on a particular property. But usually you're going to go 3 years if you start in the first year. Of course, if you appeal the second year of the triennial reassessment, then that would be good for only 2 years. And if you do it in the last year, it's good for only 1 year. Then you get reassessed.
So going back to the Board of Review and the number of appeals that you handle, kind of what percentage that represents of the Cook County property owner population, and then the success rate?
Well, let me give you a sort of a timeline here. I was an analyst for the Board of Review back in 1999. It was my first year there. I worked for a commissioner by the name of Maureen Murphy. And in that year, we were adjudicating 1998 appeals, and we had 95,000 property index numbers appealed. Now, we keep track of appeals in two ways, based on the property index numbers and based on the actual cases. So, in other words, your house, most houses have 1 PIN. Some have 2.
Sometimes if, like, you're Louis Gutierrez, you don't have a PIN at all. You don't even appear on the property tax rolls for a period of time.
That could happen.
Yeah.
If you're a factory, you might be sitting on 20 PINs. It just depends. So the factory files their 20 PINs. That's one appeal, one case, but it's 20 PINs.
Right.
In any case, back in '99, it was 95,000 PINs. 2 years ago, we had a record number of appeals. We had 477,000 property index numbers appealed. Now that's out of a total of approximately 1.8 million possible.
So, more than a quarter.
In that range.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so, and just even thinking 95 over the course of, a decade and a half, 95,000 to, what did you say, 450,000?
477,000.
477,000. To increase by nearly a factor of 5 over 15 years says something about property taxation in Cook County, I would submit, because, oh, by the way, Cook County has actually been losing population during that period of time.
Although it hasn't been losing properties, the same number of properties out there. So
right.
the population doesn't have a lot to do with it.
But the population's disposition with respect to their property taxes certainly does, and that is a seismic shift in saying, I'm not being taxed fairly, or I'm being taxed in such a way that I hope it's unfair because I can't afford it.
Right. I think there's several factors, and one you just mentioned. Without a doubt, people believe that they're overtaxed, and the taxes have gone up in a significant way, and it's becoming harder and harder for people to pay them, and they're looking for some avenue to hold the line on those taxes, and one avenue is coming to the Board of Review. I would also say that we've done a good job at the Board of Review publicizing our existence.
Yeah.
I think there was a time,
sure. Well,
20 years ago or more, when most people just didn't know that they could file an appeal. They didn't know that our office existed. So we've done a good job with that. And I would say also, there is an industry in tax appeals. There are attorneys who represent clients at the assessor's office, at the Board of Review, and they want the business and they advertise. And I know a lot of your listeners have gotten something in the mail saying, you're overassessed, let us represent you at the assessor's office at the Board of Review. We think we can get you a reduction.
Sure. Of the 477,000 filings, I believe Madigan, Getz-Danner represented 476,000. Well, is that about right?
Madigan and Getz-Danner represent mostly commercial properties.
Sure.
And the majority of the appeals we get are residential, although there's a significant number of commercial industrial. There simply aren't as many of those as there are residential properties, and so those people appeal.
Right, because Madigan gets a name, or Madigan, I'm talking about House Speaker Mike Madigan, who writes property tax law, and then he's a property tax appeals attorney, but there's no conflict, so don't think that. He represents huge commercial property taxpayers like the owners of Willis Tower, for example, because that's, you know, a third of savings on a $50 or $60 million property tax bill. Turns out to be a lot of money for the property tax appeals attorney. Oh, and by the way, as you mentioned earlier, it also turns out to have a real impact on everybody else's property taxes when that savings for Willis Tower, let's say, for example, is distributed among other property taxpayers.
That's true. You asked about I think what you referred to as a success rate. I don't want to call it that.
Right.
It's a success for those appealing. For us, it's just the job that we're doing.
Okay.
In any case, the numbers have varied. I remember back in 1999 when I was first an analyst, it was approximately 57%, I believe that was the number that year, that received a reduction of all appeals.
Right.
And these are based on PIN numbers.
Residential and commercial.
Residential and commercial. Now that number has gone up and down every year since that time. I've seen it go as high as 73%. I believe that was in 2009. And I've seen it go as low as 49%. This past year, I think the number was right around 64%. I don't have it memorized.
Okay, so
I'm fairly close.
So you're talking about a half to, let's say, 2/3 of appeals result in a reduction. So what does that say about the accuracy of the assessment system?
Well, it says that it's a mass appraisal system, and when you do mass appraisal, you tend to have a lot of errors. In other counties where you have township assessors and the number of properties is significantly smaller, and granted they may have smaller offices, but it's easier to do, I think, an accurate job. I've never worked at the assessor's office, so I'm not an insider in terms of the technique he uses to assess.
Well, you couldn't unless your name was Barrios.
Right. What I've been told, and this is what I was told, I recall when I was a township assessor in Wheeling Township, and we had a visit from a representative from the assessor's office, was every 3 years when the assessor reassesses 1/3 of Cook County, so he'll do the northern suburbs, the southern suburbs, and Chicago, and then it'll rotate around every 3 years. What they do is they look at sales data from all the properties in that section of Cook County, and they'll break it down by township, they'll break it down by neighborhoods within the township, and they look at the sales data. They give more weight to more recent sales data than sales data from longer ago, and they have information on details about each property, you know, the number of bedrooms and bathrooms, whether there's a basement or a garage, is the garage attached, is the basement full or finished, on and on. And they take that data that they have on the sold properties, they compute a value for the attributes those properties have, and then they apply it via something called regression analysis. They've got a computer system, and it applies a value to all properties. When someone comes to the Board of Review, especially a commercial property, they're presenting to us firsthand data on income. Assuming it's a property that's rented out, it's an office building, let's say, owner of the office building is renting those units, and he'll give us data on vacancy, on rents, on expenses that has to do, you know, with the value of the property, and we will compute a value. And if we think it's fairly assessed, we'll leave it where it's at. If we think they deserve a reduction, we grant a reduction.
The other wrinkle in Cook County as compared to the rest of the state of Illinois, the other 101 counties, is you have commercial subsidizing residential in Cook County.
Right, and that's something that distinguishes Cook County from every other county in Illinois. In every other county, residential and commercial property are all assessed the same at a rate of 33 1/3%. But in Cook County, it's different. Commercial industrial properties are assessed at 25% of value, residential at 10% of value. So even before you count the homeowner, senior freeze exemptions that are available to residential property, commercial property, let's say a barber owns a building, it's a barber shop, it's worth $500,000. And he also owns a home. He's a very good barber, he makes a lot of money. He owns a home that's worth $500,000. He's going to pay 2.5 times more on the commercial property, the barber shop, than he's going to pay on the residential property.
Right.
So he is subsidized, commercial industrial is subsidizing all residential property.
Right, and that's part of what has destroyed the manufacturing and industrial base in South Suburban Cook County, because you have businesses over the last several decades that have been looking at their property taxes, so their cost of doing business in South Suburban Cook County and blue-collar suburbs, Blue Island, Dalton, Harvey, Chicago Heights, et cetera, and comparing that to what they could do in Will County, right across the border, or Northwest Indiana, particularly after Northwest Indiana imposed their 2% hard cap on commercial property taxes as a percentage of value, and so people left.
You're exactly right, Dan. The south suburbs have been in a death spiral for many years. And what you have is when a business recognizes they can go across the border and pay less in property taxes, they leave that property. Now, if they're renting it from the owner now has a vacant property. Now, of course, they'll try to rent it out. But if there's no one that's game for renting out that property, it remains vacant. And you know what they do? They file an appeal with the assessor, and they may get relief. But if they don't, they come to the Board of Review. And they show us their income statement. And their income statement shows zero. And if it shows zero, we're going to reduce the assessment on that property. They subsequently pay less in taxes, and that means all other property owners. The residential property owners pay more, but the commercial property owners that remain, they pay more too.
Sure.
And that's the spiral that they're in.
So the west side and the south side of Chicago is the same thing. So going back to the residential side, you look at the assessments that are made. So residential, where you have commercial at 2.5 times residential in Cook County. So that of course includes Chicago. And we looked at this in Chicago CityWire, did analyses by region of property taxes in Cook and the Collars, and by neighborhood in the city of Chicago. And you find the highest property taxes as a percentage of home value in the county are in places like Fort Heights, 10% plus. 10% of home value, your property tax bill. You're paying for your home to the extent that anybody even owns a home in some of these neighborhoods or communities. Paying for your home just in property taxes every 5 to 7 years. It's absurd. It's a stick-up job. So it's the same thing in the poorer, more crime-ridden neighborhoods on the south and west sides of Chicago. That's an issue, right? People don't want to be there. The tax base shrinks, so forth. Chicago ostensibly would be able to absorb that more, but even sans that, it's a curious thing when we look at just individual homes, and we find, the Cook County's assessor's office has the property assessed at $115,000 in Lawndale, for example. And yet, in April of this year, the property sold for $39,000. So you're paying property taxes off of a $115,000 assessment, but the real market value, what would somebody actually pay for that, is a fraction of how the Cook County Assessor's Office assesses it. This is the opposite of the story that Jason Grotto recently told in a series of articles in the Tribune, where he's talking about how previous assessors, previous to Barrios, Houlihan in particular, artificially kept residential property taxes low to, give Daley and the Democrat machine a narrative for re-election. We're holding the line in your property taxes, right? But in some of these neighborhoods, particularly disproportionately minority neighborhoods, the opposite is happening. They're being overassessed for properties that are being assessed at a level that's a multiple of the actual market price the property will bear. And so they're paying a much higher percentage of their property value in property taxes as compared to, say, me in Streeterville or somebody in River North or Lincoln Park. And that creates a real inequity in the system, too.
You're right, and I can't explain that inequity. I can tell you if those people were to come to the Board of Review and file an appeal, I'd say they'd have a pretty good chance at getting some justice.
So the Board of Review is you, the lone Republican, and 2 Democrats?
Michael Cabinargi represents most of the northern half of Chicago and some northern suburbs like Evanston Township and Niles Township. Larry Rogers represents sort of the southern half of Chicago and a lot of near south side suburban areas. So yes, it's the 3 of us at the Board of Review.
So how does the distribution of work in terms of, so obviously it's regional by appeals, and then is the the number of appeals and the what I call a success rate, which you just call a clearance rate, is it or adjustment rate, is it fairly consistent across the three of you?
Well, actually, to correct you on that, we don't review by district.
Oh, you don't?
We don't. The appeals come in and they are distributed randomly to each commissioner.
So you're not being a homer for your...
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes some sense.
And that's the best way.
Yeah, okay.
So each commissioner has analysts that work for them. And the analysts are ones that review the appeal, look at the evidence, and make a decision. Now, to get a reduction, first of all appeals are looked at by 3 analysts, 1 analyst for each commissioner. To get a reduction, 2 of the 3 analysts have to agree that a reduction is warranted. But when those appeals come in, they are distributed randomly.
No, they're distributed randomly, but you still have the address.
Yes, yeah.
So, I mean, you know if this appeal is in your district or not.
But of course, you know, if you're the first analyst, if it's an analyst for me and they've got an appeal from my district, and though this would be contrary to every order I've ever given to anyone that works for me, if they decided they wanted to help somebody from the home district, that file is going to an analyst now for Mike Cabinargi or Larry Rogers.
So you got to get the second opinion, basically.
Exactly.
Okay.
And no one's going to go along with that.
But
you know.
so across, I mean, so as the appeals are distributed, does that system produce relatively consistent, predictable results in terms of, so the distribution of appeals handled is going to be basically the same because of the way you do it. What about the kind of lead adjudicator in each before the second opinion, or do you not look at it that way? You just look at it, here's the consensus opinion, and so it's really not attributed to you versus Larry Rogers.
It is a consensus opinion. You know, the lead analyst may have a little bit more sway. And, you know, the second analyst is going to look at what the lead analyst has done, and they have option to completely pull new comparables if they want to, if this is on a residential appeal. Or simply to look at the comparable properties that were used by the first analyst, and they may switch that off depending on the property and how good of a job they think the first analyst did. But in any case, it takes 2 out of 3. So it's majority rules.
Okay, and you know, for people that are trying to understand this process and the opportunities they may have to reduce their property tax bill, at least to effort, despite a lot of the pub about high-flying property tax appeals lawyers like the Speaker of the House or like Ed Burke or some of the politically connected in the city, for residential property tax payers and property owners, you don't have to hire an attorney to file an appeal and have your property taxes reduced.
That's correct, and I'm glad you brought it up, Dan, because a lot of people think that you do. A lot of people also think it's too complicated to do on their own, and nothing could be further from the truth. It's not rocket science. It's easy. I do about 50 seminars a year for residential property owners throughout my district, and it's a large district stretching from Wilmette to Barrington down to Orland Park and Palos and beyond. And it's a fairly simple system. Now, the only people that have to be represented by attorneys at the Board of Review are those who own a property that's incorporated. It might be an LLC, it might not be. Those have to have an attorney, but the 99% of residential property owners aren't incorporated entities, and so they can represent themselves. And I always recommend that unless you have a uniquely complicated case, you don't need an attorney. The only real reason to hire an attorney is if you just don't feel like doing the work yourself. But you can do the work yourself in an hour or 2 by going on the Cook County Assessor's website, pulling up comparable properties that are assessed lower than yours, and submitting those as comparables to justify a reduction at the Board of Review.
And it's probably worthwhile to save you the third that you're going to pay a property tax appeals attorney on savings if you just do it yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the suburban residents, and I can't say this in Chicago, but for suburban residents, they can go to their township assessor. That's what they're there for, and they can ask them for help. So if you don't feel up to going online yourself, maybe you don't know how to operate a computer, you don't know how to use a database, or you just don't know how the system works, you don't have time to come to my seminar, go to your township assessor. They will help you a little, or they'll help you a lot, depending on how much help you need.
Well, this kind of loose talk isn't going to generate much in the way of campaign contributions from property tax appeals attorney for you.
Well, that's
cutting
not,
into their
yeah.
business.
Yeah, that's not the goal. You know, attorneys, there are attorneys that do this job for a living. Generally speaking, I'd say they do a good job for their clients. They're professionals and they conduct themselves professionally. But for those that are residential property owners, you don't necessarily need that help.
So, I mean, pull back a second, because if you're a political office holder, you've run for office 3 times and won 3 times, and did at the local level prior to that, as you mentioned, in Wheeling Township. So from a policy perspective, I understand the limitations of your job. You're not a policymaker on property tax laws, but you especially with the experience you've had in this position over the course of the time that you've been there, I'm sure you're paying attention to where property tax rates are in this city, county, state, and you have to have an opinion about just property taxation in Illinois, which has really, in my estimation, gotten to a place where you have the government stealing people's homes right out from underneath them because of how confiscatory the property taxes are. When you're talking about at the state level, we're 2.5 times the national average at the state level, and in some places, including in suburban Cook, it's more like 3 and 4 times. And people paying for their homes every 20 years, 15, 20 years just in property taxes, and seeing their home equity destroyed as a result, just not the out-of-pocket that you pay for the increases, but how it negatively impacts the resale value of your home because of the economics that a prospective buyer is looking at with respect to buying a home anywhere in this region.
All right, so Dan, you laid out a lot of the problems. I can recall talking to Maureen Murphy about this. Now, Maureen was a big believer in the property tax. Not because she was for high taxes, she wasn't. She was for getting taxes as low as you could. But the reason the property tax has been adopted years ago is because it's dependable. You always have a property taxpayer that can pay that tax. So that,
except when they get to the level where they can't pay that tax.
You're right, and we've gotten there. So that's why we have the property tax, because it's not only dependable that it'll be paid, but it's predictable. Unlike an income tax, where if the economy does well, income taxes can come in excess of what you may have predicted. But if we hit a recession, you'll get less income taxes to the state or the federal government, and suddenly they're running a deficit. However, what I always tell people at my seminars, and people bring this up sometimes, they complain about how high their property taxes are. And I tell them, you can control your property taxes. Most people aren't willing to do the work because it's work. It really is. Most people just want their taxes to be lower. They don't really want to do something about it. So how do you control them? Well, your property taxes, by and large, go to your schools. I looked at my bill, and by the way, my bill went up 15% this cycle.
You should see if you know anybody on the board review to review an appeal of that.
A guy like me never files an appeal.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you just have to take the hit.
That's right.
Yeah.
But my tax bill, if I looked at my elementary school, high school, and community college, it was exactly 66% of my bill went to schools. So 33% went to the library, park district, village, township, county, forest preserve district, water reclamation, all that other stuff.
All the great layers.
Right. But all of those governmental entities have boards, and all of those boards are elected by taxpayers. Some of them are elected by renters who pay their taxes through their landlord.
Sure.
So what I tell people is this: if you want to control your tax bill, you have to control your local governmental board, and the biggest ones are the school boards. And you know what? Those school boards, by and large, have good people on them that care about their communities and they care about their schools. But what I've noticed is they love their schools, they love their park districts, they love their libraries so much that they want them to be the very best. And they compute the very best in being, takes money, takes a lot of money. And so oftentimes they're not shy about raising the levy to the maximum that they can by law. The levy is limited, although sometimes when they get to the limit, they may seek a referendum asking for even more money. And they may explain that if they don't get more money, well, they're going to have to cut the foreign language program, or they're going to have to cut sports or music or art. And these are things that people care about, especially parents. And so sometimes they vote for a referendum to raise the levy even more than the law might otherwise allow. And once you vote to raise that levy sticks with you forever. It never goes down unless, of course, that school board decides to lower the levy in a particular year, and that rarely happens. So my suggestion to people when they come to my seminars and they ask about this is, if you think your taxes are too high, form a slate of fiscally conservative people who are going to be dedicated to controlling costs. And unfortunately, the only real way to control costs is through salaries, because salaries represent about 80% of costs. And that's teacher salaries, but that's also administrators, that's custodial crew, that's everything. And but it's not unusual for school boards to enter into contracts where there's a regular increase, even during bad times. It might be 2, 3, 4% a year. And oftentimes that's on top of these step increases that are hidden into the agreement. And that's on top of increases for instance, people who might attain a master's degree or doctorate. And while I think it's great that people might pursue higher education, I don't know that there is any evidence that having a better education necessarily makes you a better teacher, particularly when you might be teaching English and you got your master's degree in history.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a big part of it. There's no question. I mean, that you get the government you deserve, not just at the state level, but at the local level too. And particularly for parents that are otherwise very involved in their kids' schools, but they have a kind of a blind eye when it comes to a school board that has been captured by the administration, the superintendent, the teachers have been captured by the union, or the parents have too, some combination of all of the above, and they just end up being kind of blank check writers. And the same thing to a lesser extent, because they represent a smaller fraction of the property tax bill for parks or community colleges and higher ed and the rest. So that's part of it. And then part of it, though, is also mandates imposed by the state on local school districts that are unfunded, and that the school districts have to find a way to come up with local money to fund state mandates that don't have dollars attached. That's a legitimate beef at the local level towards the state. And so thinking about this holistically, it seems like there is a demand brewing for rethinking how we fund K through 12 education, which is the primary driver of property taxation, as you mentioned, and in so doing, providing permanent, long-term relief for property taxes, not these phony baloney property tax freezes that we've had for the last 30 years that have resulted in the highest property taxes in the nation, and kind of making the state, putting the political pressure on the state to get out of a lot of things that it's been doing terribly. And focus on its core deliverables, like funding, being the primary funder of K through 12 education, and maybe a redistribution of responsibility away from property tax owners to the state, with a hard cap on property taxation so that the school districts can't have it both ways, blank checks from both sides. Maybe that's a way to go. I mean, that's what Indiana's done. That's to some extent what Michigan has done as well. I mean, there are other states that do this. This is not a laboratory experiment. And, frankly, I mean, it's so bad in Illinois. As I mentioned, all the states in the country, which is a handful, that have no income tax, still have lower property taxes than Illinois, including a big, diverse state that is actually more populous than Illinois, called Florida. So, I mean, is that the conversation that you think we should be having? It shouldn't be just kind of, a short-term, this fiscal year or this calendar year relief from your property tax bill, and hey, organize a slate of candidates and take over your local school board or local park board. It should be a bigger conversation, it seems to me, about how we do this thing called funding K through 12 education, which everybody wants to do, but do it in such a way that doesn't destroy home equity in the process for the appearance of local control, and also connects those inputs with the outputs, what the schools are actually producing, which is a whole other conversation that many of those administrators and teachers union representatives don't really want to have.
Dan, I agree with you. I would like to add two things, and that is, when a high school district is spending $20,000 per student, it seems to me like that's a lot. Maybe they could do it for less. And when you talk about the state of Illinois taking over, obviously the devil's in the details. Because if the state of Illinois suddenly had to take over funding a significantly larger proportion of the cost of education, assuming that the cost of education stayed the same or continued to grow,
Right.
that would be, I can't imagine what the income tax or the sales tax in Illinois might be.
Well, right,
You'd
but
have to address a lot of other things, much like the governor was trying to address with his
on the
plans.
spend side, though, I mean, the whole point is to make this a daisy chain. In order to this, we have to give up that. It turns out we're not very good at this. It's really beyond the core function of government, so we're out of this business. Or we have to look at how we do our Medicaid program. We have to look at the places we spend money.
Clearly.
We have to look at public sector pensions. We have to do something to refashion those on a go-forward basis. We have to look at how we invest in infrastructure. And we have to look at the kind of support we provide per pupil on higher ed. We have to basically, kind of melt down this state, since it's melting down anyway, and reconceive what state government should be in the business of, what it shouldn't be, what responsible spending levels are to provide access to quality education throughout the state is, those sorts of things, and maybe look around to states that are doing so much better than Illinois at a considerably lower price point and say, well, why don't we emulate what they're doing? Why don't we try that? It seems to be working in, say, Indiana. I don't think Hoosiers are all that different from residents of Illinois, so maybe there are best practices we could adopt here that would allow us to do the things we say we want to do.
You're right, and Indiana is a great example, Wisconsin as well, and I'm sure there's many other states we can look at. One thing you didn't mention is we need to grow the economy, and to grow the economy, we got to make Illinois more attractive for people who want to start businesses or expand businesses or who are contemplating moving. And I know that was at the top of the agenda for Governor Rauner. He hasn't had much success at that so far, but hopefully smarter heads will prevail over time, and we can get that kind of economic environment that we need.
As somebody who's been successful electorally in suburban Cook County, what advice and counsel do you have for the rest of the Republican Party? Because suburban Cook County and the collar counties is where the Republican Party needs to make its bones if it's ever going to be a majority party again. You've been successful in places where a lot of, for example, state legislative candidates haven't been.
Well, great question. I'd say stick to your principles, explain why you believe what you believe, and explain it in detail if you possibly can, and let people know that you're sympathetic to their problems and that the solutions you're offering can work.
All right. That's the final word and an important thought for prospective suburban Republican candidates for offices up and down the ballot. He is Dan Patlak, Commissioner on Cook County Board of Tax Review, our guest on this edition of Against the Current. Dan, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it, Dan.
Great.